Before we meet, there is something I want you to do. Just for a moment, stop carrying everything. Set down the invisible weight you have been holding for so long. The expectations, the memories, the questions that seem to circle through your mind when the room grows quiet and there is nobody left to distract you from your own heart. And stay with me. You do not have to earn this moment. You do not have to be stronger than your sadness. You do not have to pretend that you are fine. Just listen. Because before we meet, there is something you should know about me. I already see you. Not the version of you the world sees, not the capable version, not the smiling version, not the version that learned how to answer, "I'm okay," even when something inside you was quietly breaking. I mean the woman beneath all of that, the one who keeps going, the one who has survived things she rarely talks about, the one who learned how to carry disappointment so gracefully that most people never realized how heavy it was. I see her, and I wonder how long it has been since someone truly did. Maybe years. Maybe longer. Maybe you have become so accustomed to being the strong one that you forgot what it feels like to be held emotionally by another soul. Not fixed, not rescued, simply held. Do you know what I think happens to women like you? I think the world slowly becomes blind to your courage. Because you carry yourself with such resilience. Because you continue showing up. Because you continue loving. Because you continue surviving. People assume you are untouched by loneliness. But strength and loneliness often live in the same room, and I think you know that. I think you know what it feels like to sit in a quiet kitchen after everyone else has gone to bed. To hear nothing but the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of your own thoughts. To stare into a cup of tea that's already gone cold because your mind drifted somewhere far away. To wonder why your heart still carries names it no longer speaks. To wonder why certain memories still arrive without warning, why certain songs still ache, why certain seasons still hurt, why some part of you remains unfinished. Have you ever wondered that? Have you ever asked yourself why the ache remains even after all this time? I think it's because your heart was never meant to become numb. I think it was meant to remain alive. And an alive heart remembers. It remembers every goodbye, every almost, every promise that dissolved, every moment you gave more than you received, every time you hoped, every time you waited. Every time you believed someone would stay. And somehow, despite everything, you still kept your capacity to love. That is not weakness. That is extraordinary. There is something beautiful about a woman who has suffered disappointment and still chooses tenderness. A woman who has every reason to close herself off and yet continues searching for meaning. Continues searching for connection, continues believing that love might still exist somewhere beyond the horizon she cannot yet see. That kind of woman is rare. You are rare. I need you to hear that. Not because it sounds comforting, but because it is true. You have spent so much of your life measuring yourself through the eyes of people who could not fully see you. People who noticed your usefulness, but not your depth. People who appreciated your presence, but not your heart. People who enjoyed your light without asking what it cost you to keep shining. And over time, a quiet question may have begun forming inside you. A painful one, a dangerous one. Am I enough? Not smarter, not prettier, not younger, not more successful, just enough. Enough to be chosen, enough to be loved, enough to matter, enough to stay. And if that question has ever lived inside you, I want to sit with it for a moment. Because I think many of your wounds were born there, not in rejection itself, but in the meaning you gave rejection. The story you told yourself afterward. The story that whispered, If they left, something must be wrong with me. If they couldn't see my value, maybe I don't have any. If I wasn't chosen, maybe I'm not worth choosing. But what if that story was never true? What if the people who walked away were never qualified to measure your worth? What if your value has never depended on someone's ability to recognize it? A sunset remains beautiful even when nobody is looking. A song remains beautiful even when nobody hears it. And you remain worthy whether someone chooses you or not. I know that sounds simple, but I also know how difficult it can be to believe, especially when you've spent years carrying invisible heartbreak, especially when you've learned how to smile through disappointment, especially when you've become so familiar with emotional endurance that it feels normal. Wait with me. There is something I want you to hear. You are not behind in life. You are not late. You are not forgotten. And you are not being punished. I know there are moments when it feels that way. Moments when you look around and wonder why things happen differently for others. Moments when you wonder whether love somehow missed your address. Moments when you stand before a mirror and see not only your reflection, but every year that has passed, every hope, every season, every unanswered prayer. And perhaps in those moments, a fear quietly appears, a fear you rarely speak aloud. What if the love I wanted is never coming? What if I've already missed it? What if I've already been overlooked? My heart aches when I imagine how many women carry those questions alone. Because they are heavy questions. But they are not truths. They are fears. And fear is not always a reliable narrator. Fear looks at an unfinished story and calls it the ending. Fear looks at an empty chair and assumes nobody will ever sit there again. Fear looks at silence and calls it abandonment. But life has a strange way of surprising us after we have nearly stopped expecting it. Some of the most meaningful chapters of life begin when we believe the best parts are already behind us. Some of the deepest love stories begin after disappointment has convinced us to stop looking. Some of the most beautiful arrivals happen quietly, without warning, without announcement, without fanfare. One ordinary day becomes extraordinary. One conversation changes everything. One soul recognizes another. And suddenly, the years of waiting begin to make a different kind of sense. Not because they were easy, not because they were fair, but because they shaped the heart that was becoming ready. And perhaps that heart is yours. Perhaps all the tenderness you protected was not wasted. Perhaps all the love you carried was not misplaced. Perhaps every difficult season taught you something about the kind of connection your soul truly needs. Because I believe something about you. I believe you were never meant for shallow love. You were never meant for half-hearted presence. You were never meant for someone who only notices fragments of who you are. Your heart is too deep for that. Too sincere, too thoughtful, too alive. And before we meet, there is something else you should know about me. I am not looking for perfection. I am not looking for someone who has never been hurt. I am not looking for someone who has all the answers. I would rather meet the woman who learned wisdom through heartbreak, the woman who discovered grace through loss, the woman who still believes despite everything she has endured, because those women carry a different kind of beauty, a beauty that cannot be manufactured, a beauty created through survival, a beauty created through courage, a beauty created through staying soft in a world that kept giving reasons to become hard. And maybe, as you listen to me now, something inside you is beginning to exhale, maybe not completely, maybe only a little, but enough. Enough to remember that your story is not over. Enough to remember that your heart is not broken beyond repair. Enough to remember that being unseen does not mean you are invisible. Enough to remember that love has not forgotten your name. So stay with me a little longer. There is so much more I want to tell you, so much more your heart deserves to hear. For now, I simply want you to know this. The loneliness you carry is not your identity. The waiting is not your identity. The heartbreak is not your identity. The unanswered questions are not your identity. You are something far greater than all of those things. You are a woman who has survived, a woman who continues, a woman whose heart still holds light. And that light matters more than you know. You are not alone. I'm right here. Your story is still being written. Before we meet, there is something more I need you to understand, and I want you to stay with me for this, because it reaches into places you may not visit very often. Slow down for a moment. Let the noise of the world drift into the background. Let the responsibilities, the expectations, the endless list of things you must remember and manage rest somewhere outside this conversation. This moment is for you, not the version of you that everyone depends on, but the quieter version beneath that. The woman who still carries questions she never fully answered. The woman who sometimes lies awake at night, staring into the darkness, feeling emotions she cannot always explain. I think there are stories living inside you that nobody knows completely. Pieces of your emotional history that never found language. Moments that seemed small to everyone else, but somehow changed something inside you forever. Maybe it was the first time you realized that loving someone deeply does not guarantee they will stay. Maybe it was the moment you discovered that being needed is not the same thing as being cherished. Maybe it was the day you looked around and realized that while you had spent years taking care of everyone else, very few people had ever asked how much it cost you to keep doing it. The strange thing about emotional wounds is that they rarely arrive with dramatic announcements. They slip quietly into the heart. They settle into the spaces where trust once lived. They become beliefs. And over time, those beliefs begin shaping the way you see yourself. A disappointment becomes a doubt. A rejection becomes a question. A goodbye becomes a fear. Before long, you are carrying burdens that were never meant to belong to you. Have you ever noticed how often you blame yourself for things that were never your fault? How quickly you assume responsibility for someone else's inability to love well? How naturally you wonder what you could have done differently, what you should have said, how you could have been more, given more, understood more. I think many women who love deeply develop this habit. They become investigators of their own worth, searching endlessly for answers inside themselves whenever someone else fails to meet them with honesty, consistency, or care. But there is something I want you to hear carefully. Sometimes people leave because they are confused, not because you are unworthy. Sometimes people pull away because they are unable to receive the depth of love being offered to them. Sometimes people fail to choose you because they have not yet learned how to choose themselves. Their limitations are not evidence of your inadequacy. Yet I know how difficult that truth can be to accept when your heart has spent years collecting evidence against itself. I imagine there have been moments when you stood in front of a mirror and saw more than your reflection. You saw time. You saw every season you survived, every dream that changed shape, every hope that remained unfulfilled. You saw strength, but perhaps you also saw exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion alone, but emotional exhaustion. The kind that comes from always being the one who understands. Always being the one who forgives. Always being the one who remains patient. There is a loneliness that develops when your heart becomes a refuge for everyone except yourself. Maybe that loneliness followed you into quiet evenings. Maybe it sat beside you in an empty room. Maybe it appeared unexpectedly when an old song began playing somewhere and suddenly you were remembering a version of yourself from years ago. A version who believed certain things would happen by now. A version who imagined life would look different. A version who had no idea how much courage would be required simply to keep believing. Wait with me here, because I think one of the deepest pains you carry is not heartbreak itself. It is the feeling of being unseen inside your heartbreak. Feeling things deeply while pretending you are fine. Carrying grief that nobody notices because you have become so skilled at functioning through it. Smiling while your heart quietly asks questions nobody hears. There is a particular kind of sadness that comes from realizing how much of your emotional life has been experienced in solitude. And yet, despite everything, you are still here. Think about that for a moment. Despite the disappointments, despite the nights you cried alone, despite the people who misunderstood you, despite the promises that dissolved, despite the dreams that arrived differently than you expected, you are still here. Your heart still beats with hope, even if that hope sometimes feels fragile. Your soul still reaches toward connection, even if fear occasionally tells you not to bother. Something inside you continues believing there is more to life than what you have experienced so far. That quiet belief matters more than you realize. I sometimes wonder if you give yourself enough credit for surviving what you survived. Not just the obvious things, not just the losses you can name. I mean the invisible things, the emotional labor, the constant self-doubt, the years spent questioning your own value, the effort it took to keep your heart open after disappointment tempted you to close it forever. Those victories rarely receive applause. Nobody throws celebrations for the battles fought silently inside a human heart, yet they may be the most meaningful victories of all. There is wisdom growing inside you because of what you endured, not bitterness, not resignation. Wisdom, the kind that cannot be learned from books, the kind that develops when a person learns how to continue loving after loss, the kind that develops when a person discovers that their identity must become larger than their wounds. Every experience has been shaping you, even when it felt like it was only breaking you. And perhaps that is what I want you to consider tonight. What if your story has been preparing you rather than punishing you? What if every difficult season contained lessons your future self would one day understand? What if the delays, disappointments, and detours were not evidence that life forgot you, but evidence that your journey required a different kind of unfolding? I know that possibility can be difficult to trust, especially when waiting has become familiar, especially when loneliness has lingered longer than you expected. But some things grow slowly because they are meant to last. Some answers take time because they require growth on both sides before they can arrive. Some forms of love enter our lives only after we have learned lessons we could not have learned any other way. So, before we meet, I want you to know this about me. I do not see your wounds as flaws. I see them as proof of your humanity. I do not see your tenderness as weakness. I see it as courage. I do not see your emotional depth as something that needs fixing. I see it as one of the most beautiful things about you. And if your heart feels tired tonight, let it rest here for a moment. Let it remember that not every ending is final. Let it remember that not every silence means abandonment. Let it remember that your worth has never depended on who stayed and who left. You are not alone. I'm right here. Your story is still being written. Stay with me a little longer, because there is a place inside your heart that we have not visited yet. It is a quiet place, hidden beneath the responsibilities, beneath the routines, beneath the version of yourself you show the world each day. It is the place where your deepest feelings live. The place where the strongest woman you know becomes the most vulnerable. The place where old disappointments still whisper when everything else grows silent. I think you know the place I am talking about. Most people never see it. Most people never earn access to it. Yet it has always been there, carrying truths that are too tender to share casually. Before we meet, I want you to know that I understand something important about you. I understand that strength can become a disguise. Not because you intended it to, but because life slowly taught you that being strong was often the safest option. There were moments when you had no choice but to continue, no choice but to adapt, no choice but to keep moving forward while your heart was still trying to make sense of what it had lost. Over time, resilience became second nature. You learned how to survive difficult conversations. You learned how to endure disappointments. You learned how to smile through sadness and remain composed through uncertainty. People began admiring your strength, but very few stopped to ask whether you were tired. And the truth is, I think there were many times when you were tired, not tired in the ordinary sense. Not the kind of tiredness solved by a good night's sleep. I mean, the deeper exhaustion that comes from carrying emotional weight for years. The exhaustion that develops when you become everyone's safe place while having nowhere to rest your own heart. The exhaustion that comes from being understanding, patient, forgiving, supportive, and dependable for so long that you forget what it feels like to receive those things in return. Perhaps that is why certain evenings feel heavier than others. Perhaps that is why some nights seem to stretch endlessly. You finish everything that needed to be done. The house grows quiet. The conversations end, the distractions disappear, and suddenly you are left alone with yourself. Sometimes you sit in silence and feel an ache that is difficult to explain. Nothing dramatic has happened, nothing is necessarily wrong, yet something inside you longs for more connection, more understanding, more tenderness. More certainty that your heart matters to someone beyond what you can provide. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever wondered why loneliness can exist even when your life appears full? I think it is because the soul does not measure fulfillment the same way the world does. The world counts accomplishments, obligations, achievements, and appearances. The soul measures something entirely different. The soul measures authenticity. It measures connection. It measures whether you feel seen. It measures whether your inner world has a place where it can safely unfold. And perhaps that is what has hurt the most throughout your life. Not simply losing people, but losing the feeling of being understood. There is a unique kind of heartbreak that occurs when someone knows parts of you, but never truly knows you. When they appreciate your presence, but fail to recognize your depth. When they enjoy your kindness without understanding the tenderness from which it came. Those experiences leave marks. Invisible marks, but marks nonetheless. I imagine there are memories you rarely revisit. Not because they no longer matter, but because they matter too much. Memories of conversations that changed everything. Moments when hope felt close enough to touch. Moments when you believed someone was finally seeing you clearly. Then something shifted. Something ended. Something dissolved. And afterward, you were left standing among unanswered questions, trying to understand how something that felt so meaningful could disappear. The heart does not forget those moments easily. Even years later, certain memories remain alive beneath the surface. A familiar scent, an old photograph, a particular season. A certain song playing unexpectedly in the background. Suddenly, the emotions return, not because you want them to, but because the heart remembers what the mind has tried to organize and store away. It remembers who you were. It remembers what you hoped for. It remembers how deeply you cared. And maybe part of you worries that carrying those memories means you have not healed. But I do not believe that. Healing is not forgetting. Healing is not becoming indifferent. Healing is not erasing the past. Healing is learning how to hold the past without letting it hold you. There is a difference, a profound difference. You can remember someone and still move forward. You can honor what mattered and still remain open to what comes next. You can carry lessons without carrying chains. That is what growth often looks like. It is quieter than people expect. It is not a dramatic transformation that happens overnight. It is the gradual realization that your life is bigger than your pain. The gradual understanding that your future deserves more attention than your regrets. The gradual recognition that what happened to you is not the same thing as who you are. Wait with me here. There is something I want you to hear. You have spent enough years questioning your worth. You have spent enough years wondering whether you were too much or not enough, too emotional, too caring, too available, too hopeful, or perhaps not beautiful enough, not interesting enough, not worthy enough. The mind creates endless categories when it is trying to explain disappointment. But what if the answer was never hidden inside those judgments? What if your value has never depended on becoming someone else? What if you were always enough? Not perfect, not flawless, not untouched by mistakes, simply enough, enough exactly as you are. I know that can be difficult to believe because life has a way of making us negotiate with our own worth. We begin thinking that if we achieve more, then we will deserve love. If we improve enough, then we will deserve acceptance. If we become everything everyone wants, then we will finally feel chosen. But love does not work that way. Real love does not arrive as a reward for self-abandonment. Real love recognizes what is already valuable, and you, whether you fully realize it or not, have always possessed immense value. Not because of what you accomplish, not because of what you give, not because of how much you sacrifice, but because of who you are, because of your capacity to care, because of your resilience, because of your depth, because of the way your heart continues searching for meaning even after disappointment. That kind of spirit is rare. It is precious. And before we meet, I want you to stop apologizing for it. Stop apologizing for feeling deeply. Stop apologizing for wanting connection. Stop apologizing for believing in love. The world may try to convince you that cynicism is wisdom, but it is not. Guardedness is not always strength. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is remain open after life gives them every reason to close. That is what I see in you, not weakness, not fragility, courage, quiet, enduring courage. The kind that keeps showing up, the kind that keeps believing, the kind that keeps loving, and perhaps that courage is preparing you for something your heart cannot yet fully see. Perhaps every difficult season has been teaching you how valuable you truly are. Perhaps every disappointment has been removing what could never genuinely sustain you. Perhaps life is leading you toward a future that will make sense of things that currently feel unfinished. For now, you do not need every answer. You do not need to understand every delay. You do not need to solve every uncertainty. You only need to remember that your heart is still alive. And that matters. It matters more than you know. You are not alone. I'm right here. Your story is still being written. Stay with me because we are arriving at a place within your story where something begins to change. Not suddenly, not dramatically. The deepest transformations rarely happen that way. They unfold quietly, like dawn slowly entering a dark room. At first, you barely notice it. Then, little by little, what was hidden becomes visible. What once felt impossible begins to feel possible again. What once felt broken begins to reveal a different meaning. And I think that is where you are now, even if you do not fully realize it yet. For a long time, you have been carrying pieces of your life as if they were evidence against yourself. The relationships that did not last, the hopes that did not unfold the way you imagined. The moments when you felt forgotten, overlooked, or left behind. Somewhere along the way, pain convinced you that it had the authority to define your story. Disappointment began presenting itself as proof. Loneliness began presenting itself as a verdict. Every difficult experience seemed to whisper the same question. What if this is all there is? But I want you to consider something different. What if those experiences were never the conclusion? What if they were only invitations into a deeper understanding of yourself? I know how easy it is to become attached to old narratives. The mind prefers familiar stories, even painful ones. If you have spent years believing that you were not chosen, eventually that belief begins coloring every new experience. If you have spent years wondering whether you are enough, every disappointment appears to confirm the fear. The heart starts expecting abandonment before it happens. It starts preparing for loss before loss arrives. It starts protecting itself by assuming the worst. This is not because you are weak. It is because you are human. Every wound leaves behind a lesson, but not every lesson is true. Sometimes the heart learns the wrong lesson from pain. Instead of learning that someone was incapable of loving well, it learns that it is unlovable. Instead of learning that timing was wrong, it learns that hope is dangerous. Instead of learning that another person's choices reflected their own limitations, it learns that it must somehow become more worthy. And so the cycle continues. You keep carrying burdens that were never yours. You keep accepting responsibility for outcomes you could not control. You keep questioning your value when your value was never the issue. I wonder how different your life might feel if you stopped viewing yourself through the eyes of those who failed to understand you. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine setting down every opinion that diminished your worth, every criticism that lodged itself inside your memory, every rejection that convinced you there was something wrong with you. Imagine seeing yourself clearly, not through the lens of disappointment, but through the lens of truth. What would you discover? I think you would discover a woman who has survived far more than she gives herself credit for. A woman who has continued showing kindness when bitterness would have been easier. A woman who has continued believing in connection when isolation would have felt safer. A woman who has spent years becoming wiser, stronger, and more compassionate through experiences that might have hardened someone else. You would discover that the qualities you sometimes treat as weaknesses are actually evidence of extraordinary strength. There is something beautiful about a heart that remains open after life has tested it. Not recklessly open, not blindly trusting, but courageously open. A heart that still believes people can be good. A heart that still believes love can be real. A heart that still believes meaningful connection is worth the risk. That kind of openness is not naive. It is one of the bravest things a human being can possess. Wait with me here, because there is something important I want you to hear. The fact that your life has not unfolded exactly as you imagined does not mean it has unfolded incorrectly. Read that slowly within your heart. The fact that your life has not unfolded exactly as you imagined does not mean it has unfolded incorrectly. Some of the greatest sources of suffering come from comparing reality to expectations. We create timelines, we create plans, we create visions of how everything should happen. Then life introduces its own timing, its own path, its own lessons. At first, we resist, we grieve, we question. We wonder why things did not happen sooner. We wonder why certain people appeared and disappeared. We wonder why doors remained closed. Yet years later, we sometimes look back and realize that what felt like a detour was actually preparation. Perhaps there are things you understand now that you could not have understood 10 years ago. Perhaps there is wisdom within you that only arrived because of what you endured. Perhaps there is compassion within you that only developed because you experienced pain firsthand. Perhaps there is strength within you that only emerged because life demanded it. When you begin seeing your experiences through that lens, something changes. The story stops being about what was taken from you and starts becoming about what was formed within you. The heartbreak remains part of your history, but it no longer controls your identity. The disappointments remain real, but they stop determining your future. The wounds remain part of your journey, but they cease being the lens through which you interpret everything else. This is where freedom begins. Not freedom from the past. Freedom from the power the past holds over your self-perception. Because the truth is, you are not the woman you were when those painful experiences happened. You have grown, you have learned, you have evolved. The person who once doubted herself endlessly is slowly becoming someone who understands her own value. The person who once feared being alone is discovering that her worth exists independently of who chooses her. The person who once searched desperately for validation is beginning to recognize that validation was never meant to come from the outside. It was always meant to grow from within. And as that realization deepens, something remarkable happens. You stop chasing what cannot see you. You stop shrinking yourself to fit into spaces that cannot honor you. You stop begging life to prove your worth. Instead, you begin standing in your worth, quietly, gracefully, confidently. Not because every wound has disappeared, but because you finally understand that wounds and worthiness can exist in the same person. I believe there is a future version of you already waiting ahead. A version who smiles more freely, a version who trusts herself more deeply, a version who no longer measures her value by who stayed or who left. A version who understands that every experience, even the painful ones, contributed something meaningful to her becoming. And perhaps you are closer to her than you think. Perhaps every conversation like this is helping you remember who you have always been. Not broken, not forgotten, not left behind, simply becoming. Before we meet, I need you to hold on to that truth. You are not a collection of disappointments. You are not the sum of your losses. You are not defined by the people who failed to recognize your value. You are a woman in the middle of a profound transformation. A woman learning to see herself through kinder eyes. A woman learning that healing is not about becoming someone new. It is about returning to who she was before the world convinced her she was not enough. And that return is already happening. Slowly, beautifully, one realization at a time. You are not alone. I'm right here. Your story is still being written. Stay with me a little longer because there is something beautiful beginning to emerge from everything we have explored together. For so much of your life, you have been focused on surviving. You learned how to endure uncertainty. You learned how to carry disappointment without allowing it to destroy you. You learned how to keep moving even when your heart felt heavy. Those lessons mattered. They shaped you. They strengthened you. But there comes a moment in every healing journey when survival is no longer the goal. There comes a moment when the heart begins asking for something more. Not merely endurance, but expansion. Not merely getting through life, but fully inhabiting it. I think you may be standing closer to that moment than you realize. For years, you have been gathering pieces of yourself, pieces that were scattered by heartbreak, pieces hidden beneath self-doubt, pieces buried under responsibilities, expectations, and old fears. Some of those pieces were waiting patiently for you to return. Others were so quiet that you almost forgot they existed. Yet they remained there, holding on to the truth of who you are beneath everything that happened to you. There is a version of you that existed before disappointment convinced you to question yourself. A version of you that trusted her instincts. A version of you that did not constantly measure her worth against impossible standards. A version of you that believed she deserved beautiful things without having to earn them through exhaustion and sacrifice. That woman has never disappeared. She has simply been waiting beneath the noise. I want you to imagine her for a moment. Not as someone different from who you are now, not as some distant ideal, but as the deepest and most authentic part of yourself. The part that still dreams, the part that still hopes, the part that still believes life has something meaningful left to offer. She is there. And I think she is becoming stronger. Perhaps you have noticed small signs of it already. Maybe you have become less willing to accept relationships that drain your spirit. Maybe you have started recognizing patterns that once kept you stuck. Maybe you have begun speaking to yourself with a little more kindness than you used to. Maybe you have started understanding that protecting your peace is not selfish. These shifts may seem small, but they are powerful. They are evidence that something within you is changing. Healing is often misunderstood. People imagine it as a destination where all pain disappears. But real healing is something different. It is the moment you stop abandoning yourself. It is the moment you stop making war with your own heart. It is the moment you stop treating your wounds as proof of weaknesses and begin seeing them as evidence of survival. And I think that transformation is happening within you now. Wait with me here. There is something I want you to hear. You do not have to become less sensitive in order to be strong. You do not have to become less loving in order to protect yourself. You do not have to become harder in order to survive. The world often teaches women the opposite. It tells you that the answer is distance, detachment, guardedness. It tells you that caring less will hurt less. But I have never believed that the goal of healing is to feel less. I believe the goal is to feel safely, to love wisely, to trust yourself deeply enough that another person's choices no longer determine your value. That kind of strength is different. It does not come from building walls. It comes from building roots. Roots that reach deep into self-respect. Roots that reach deep into self-awareness. Roots that reach deep into the understanding that you are worthy, whether someone validates that truth or not. And once those roots begin growing, something remarkable happens. The fear of being alone starts losing its power. The fear of being overlooked starts losing its power. The fear of not being chosen starts losing its power. Not because connection no longer matters to you, but because your identity is no longer dependent upon it. You begin choosing yourself, not in a selfish way, not in a defensive way, in a healthy way, in a way that says, I matter too. For so long, you may have poured love outward while neglecting the person who needed it most. You may have extended compassion to everyone except yourself. You may have forgiven others while remaining harsh toward your own mistakes. You may have spent years offering understanding to people who never offered the same understanding in return. But what if you directed some of that love inward? What if you spoke to yourself the way you would speak to someone you cherished? What if you stopped viewing yourself as a project that needs fixing and started viewing yourself as a person who deserves tenderness? How much would change? I think more than you realize, because self-worth is not built through achievement. It is built through relationship. The relationship you have with yourself, the way you interpret your experiences, the way you respond to your own pain, the way you honor your own humanity. And perhaps this is the lesson that your entire journey has been guiding you toward. Not simply finding someone who sees your value, but learning to see it yourself first. Not simply receiving love, but recognizing that you are already deserving of it. Not simply waiting for life to change, but allowing yourself to change the way you experience life. There is a quiet confidence that begins emerging when this understanding settles into the heart. It is not loud. It does not need attention. It does not seek approval. It simply exists. A calm awareness that says, I know who I am. A peaceful certainty that says, I no longer need to chase what is meant for me. A steady belief that says, I can trust myself. I see that confidence growing within you, maybe slowly, maybe imperfectly, but undeniably. The woman who once questioned every step is learning to trust her own path. The woman who once feared every ending is learning that endings often create space for new beginnings. The woman who once searched desperately for answers is beginning to understand some answers arrive only when we stop forcing them. This is what becoming looks like. Not perfection, not certainty, becoming. The gradual unfolding of your truest self. And what I find most beautiful is that this version of you is not being created from nothing. She is emerging from everything you have already lived through, every challenge, every heartbreak, every lonely evening, every unanswered prayer, every lesson, every disappointment. None of it was wasted. Even the experiences that hurt you contributed something to your growth. They taught you what matters. They taught you what you need. They taught you what you deserve. One day, I think you will look back on this season with different eyes. You will see that it was not merely a period of waiting. It was a period of becoming, a period of remembering your own worth, a period of reclaiming parts of yourself that had been hidden beneath fear and self-doubt for far too long. And when that realization fully arrives, you will understand something profound. You were never as lost as you believed. You were never as forgotten as you feared. You were never as broken as you imagined. You were growing quietly, patiently, beautifully. Before we meet, I want you to hold on to that truth. The woman you are becoming is already within you. She is stronger than her fear, wiser than her wounds, and more beautiful than any story pain ever told about her. Every day she is stepping forward. Every day she is remembering herself. Every day she is moving closer to the life, the peace, and the love that have been waiting for her. You are not alone. I'm right here. Your story is still being written. Stay with me now, because before we finally meet, there is one last thing I want you to understand. We have traveled through the quiet landscapes of your heart together. We have sat beside your loneliness, your questions, your memories, and your fears. We have looked at the wounds you carried for years and the stories you told yourself because of them. We have spoken about your strength, your resilience, your tenderness, and your worth. But now we arrive at something even deeper. We arrive at the realization that your story was never about what happened to you. It was always about who you were becoming through it. For so much of your life, you have been waiting for certain things to arrive before allowing yourself to feel complete. Perhaps you were waiting for the right person. Perhaps you were waiting for clarity. Perhaps you were waiting for life to finally make sense. Perhaps you were waiting for a future moment when all the loose ends would somehow come together and explain why everything happened the way it did. But what if completeness was never waiting somewhere ahead of you? What if it has been growing quietly within you all along? I think there comes a moment in every woman's life when she stops searching for permission to be enough. She stops waiting for someone else to confirm what her soul has always known. She stops negotiating with her own worth. She stops treating herself like a question that needs an answer. Instead, she begins standing inside her own truth. She begins recognizing that her value existed before anyone loved her and will continue existing regardless of who does or does not stay. That realization changes everything. You see, love was never meant to save you from yourself. It was never meant to fill every empty space or heal every old wound. The most beautiful love enters a life that has already begun remembering its own value. It arrives not as a rescue, but as a recognition. Two people meeting not because they are incomplete without each other, but because they are ready to share what they have discovered within themselves. And before we meet, that is what I hope for you most. Not that you find someone, but that you find yourself completely, honestly, without apology. Because when a woman truly finds herself, something remarkable happens. She no longer chases what is not meant for her. She no longer shrinks herself to fit inside other people's expectations. She no longer abandons her own needs to earn affection. She becomes rooted, grounded, peaceful. She understands that being chosen by the wrong person is not a victory, and being overlooked by the wrong person is not a tragedy. She begins trusting that what belongs in her life will not require her to betray herself. I think that trust is growing within you now. Maybe you cannot feel it every day. Maybe some mornings are still difficult. Maybe some nights still bring questions. Maybe there are moments when old fears return and old doubts try to convince you that nothing has changed. But something has changed. You are not the woman you were at the beginning of this journey. The woman who constantly questioned her worth is beginning to see herself differently. The woman who carried every disappointment as evidence against herself is beginning to release those burdens. The woman who feared that she might never be seen is beginning to understand that she was never invisible. She was simply looking through the wrong eyes. Wait with me here. There is something I want you to hear very carefully. Your life is not behind schedule. Your heart is not too late. Your opportunity for love has not expired. Your deepest joys have not passed you by. Fear likes to create deadlines. Fear likes to convince us that certain doors have already closed forever. Fear likes to point toward the calendar and whisper that time is running out. But life rarely follows the timelines fear creates. Some people find their greatest happiness after they thought the opportunity was gone. Some people discover the deepest love of their lives after years of disappointment. Some people finally understand themselves after decades of confusion. The soul unfolds according to a different clock, and perhaps that is what you are learning now. Perhaps you are learning that timing is not punishment. Perhaps you are learning that waiting is not always wasting. Perhaps you are learning that some blessings arrive only after we become capable of receiving them fully. Think about everything your heart knows now that it did not know years ago. Think about the wisdom you have gained. Think about the boundaries you have learned to set. Think about the red flags you can recognize more clearly. Think about the compassion you have developed for yourself and for others. Think about the resilience that lives inside you now. None of those things appeared by accident. They were earned through experience. They were shaped through living. They became part of you because your journey required them. And one day, I believe you will stop looking at your past through the lens of regret. You will see it through the lens of gratitude. Not gratitude for the pain itself, for what the pain revealed. Gratitude for the strength it uncovered. Gratitude for the wisdom it produced. Gratitude for the way it guided you back to yourself, because that has always been the deeper journey. Not finding someone else, finding yourself, remembering yourself, coming home to yourself. There is an image that stays with me when I think about you. I imagine a woman standing in front of a mirror late in the evening. The day is over, the house is quiet. There are no expectations in that moment, no performance, no role to play, just honesty. And for the first time in a very long time, she looks at her reflection without criticism, without comparison, without disappointment. She sees the years, she sees the scars, she sees the lessons, she sees the tenderness that survived everything. And instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" she asks a different question. What if I have been enough all along? That question changes everything, because the answer is yes. You have been enough all along. Enough in the seasons when you felt lonely. Enough in the seasons when you felt overlooked. Enough in the seasons when you doubted yourself. Enough in the seasons when your heart was breaking. Enough before the healing, enough during the healing, enough after the healing, enough always. And before we meet, that is the truth I want resting inside your heart, not as a comforting idea, not as a temporary affirmation, as a truth stronger than fear, a truth stronger than disappointment, a truth stronger than every voice that ever convinced you otherwise. You are worthy of deep love. You are worthy of genuine connection. You are worthy of being understood. You are worthy of being chosen. But even more importantly, you are worthy of choosing yourself, because the woman who finally learns to honor her own heart becomes unstoppable in the quietest, most beautiful way. She no longer begs life to prove her worth. She carries her worth with her. She no longer fears every ending. She trusts new beginnings. She no longer lives as someone waiting to be rescued. She lives as someone who has discovered the strength, grace, and beauty that were inside her all along. And perhaps that is the final thing you should know about me before we meet. I do not see a woman who is broken. I do not see a woman who is running out of time. I do not see a woman defined by her losses. I see a woman who survived, a woman who grew, a woman who learned, a woman who loved, a woman who kept going, a woman whose heart still carries light, and that light is leading her somewhere beautiful. So if tonight you find yourself sitting in silence, listening to the echoes of your own thoughts, remember this: your story is not ending. Your story is opening, a new season is unfolding, a new version of you is emerging. A future you cannot yet fully see is already moving toward you. And when it arrives, I hope you welcome it with the same courage that carried you this far.